This is the story of Adobe Creative Cloud. And what is interesting about this Creative Cloud transformation, or the transformation of Adobe itself, is when you talk about cloud, they didn't take their infrastructure and put it on cloud. So moving to cloud does not really necessarily mean you take your infrastructure and go to the cloud. It's the model of software delivery that they changed. So from perpetual, boxed software to cloud-based license, the subscription-based software delivery is what they moved to, and that's what they did, and that has made them really, really successful. And we're going to look at some numbers there. Now, back in 2010, Adobe was it's a creative products that Adobe was primarily into, and they were selling all this perpetual licensing. And what they had was a product cycle of 18 to 24 months, really high upfront costs. And when you are, when you have like product cycle of 18 to 24 months, you cannot, they wanted, even if they wanted to release the updates and new versions and make changes to the software, they couldn't do that because their next release would be with a, they were selling at a license of about, some of the products were or suits were about $2,400 to $3,000 and all that, right? So nobody's gonna keep buying those many softwares from you at a very regular, at a regular interval, right? And that actually, reduced the number of their customers as well, because they didn't have a recurring revenue at that point of time. So they had a very low recurring revenue. In 2010, they had just recovered from sort of a slump because of the global slowdown. And what they started realizing, what the companies who had recurring revenues had a better chance to survive. In fact, the company I was working in, which was later on acquired by Adobe, did survive fantastically well. We actually were profitable because we had a software as a service model, we had a recurring revenue, and it is now part of Adobe's marketing cloud. So Adobe has moved just from being a creative suite to the marketing, being a marketing company as well, right? And that's when they had a stagnated growth. So if you look at this number, so they had about, they had seen a really huge slump, and they had a stagnated growth. So it was almost constant. People were not buying the, the products at a, they didn't have like new customers and so on and so forth, right? So that's when they decided to make a radical change from the subscription model to the cloud. And what I mean by Creative Cloud is they didn't have software hosted on the cloud, they didn't move the infrastructure on the cloud, but they started offering this software-based, cloud-based, one is subscription, licensing, and update service. So you get low upfront cost and a subscription model. You get updates much more often, and you could basically continue using it as long as you want with a low entry barrier, right? And they didn't launch it. They didn't completely migrate to that model immediately because they wanted to test the market, right? And the first challenge they had was making sure that the customers understand the reasons behind it and the customers are ready for it. The second challenge was to actually educate the market itself, the analysts themselves, and they did in sort of iterative approach. They initially started with two versions. One was perpetual, one was the cloud-based. They got the feedback from the market, from the customers, and based on that feedback, they realized that there were completely new segment of customers who were interested in the subscription model. In fact, some of them couldn't buy the software because of the upfront cost. They could actually, because of the low entry, they could start buying those softwares and things like that, right? So, and then slowly they phased out their perpetual licensing and completely moved to the cloud-based systems, right? And the challenges they had were, first is the customers. Some of the customers were really angry because they didn't want to pay every month and do that for the lifetime. Second were analysts, so they had to really, educate analysts to look at their revenues from the, the subscription-based model and not judge them by the revenues immediately, right? And then they also had to educate their internal sales team to move to a completely different compensation model as well, right? Because subscription model and the perpetual licensing is completely sort of different, right? And that's when they started making the changes, and it was not only just the business side of change, it was also technology changes. So moving from a 16-month to 18-month release cycle to 2 weeks release cycle was a big change, right? And I have experienced that because my company was recently acquired by Adobe at that point of time, and they actually started talking to us as well in terms of how do you actually do that, because we were actually doing the 2 releases cycle and so on and so forth, right? So that was one of the challenges that they had. So educating, skilling up the people, educating the teams, making sure you move to the agile development practices from waterfall was what they started doing, right? And also, it's not just since you're changing the way you're delivering the software, you also need to think about, let's say, service-oriented architecture and so on and so forth, right? Where you, instead of having a very tightly coupled architecture, you move to a loosely coupled service-based delivery and service-based architectural thing, right? And you also have to, when you talk about transformation, you have to start doing the organizational changes. You have to start creating cross-functional teams. And even though none of these stories talk about DevOps in general, right? So when you talk about or when you hear or read about Adobe's transformation or how Paytm handled this kind of a scale and reliability, none of that is branded as DevOps. So it is probably not a DevOps story, but it's an organizational transformation story, and they were able to make changes, they were able to survive, and they were able to be successful. So if you look at the Adobe stock from 2010, that's when they made that change or decided to do that, and now you see the difference, right? That's the real transformation, and that's a fascinating story because people, companies of size Adobe, it's very difficult to start making changes, and making changes from top down and transforming the organization is a fantastic story, I would say, right? Now, what do we learn about from both of these stories? And both of these are different types of organization, different sizes of organization, different business segment and different stories. However, they were able to be successful because they were able to change. They were able to make changes. They were able to do it faster with reduced, not losing the quality, right? So you may want to, that's their business goal, right? So either you want to achieve competing advantage, you may just want to survive, or you may want to respond to the customer's requirements. Organizations need to constantly change in order to be successful, and that's the underlying point here. And that is the reason why we need to care about DevOps, right? And the success of organization is directly related to its agility, to its ability to change faster, right? And that's what DevOps offer you. So why do we need to care about DevOps? Is because it can help you, it can help your organization change faster, and that will cascade down to you as well, right? And you have a role to play as well. And what is your role is what we're going to talk about.